quite dramatic. Now, moving on to something rather different, leading lawyers have been accused this week of undermining, or at least attempting to undermine, the legal system by declaring that they will not prosecute climate activists. Think groups like Extinction Rebellion. More than 120 lawyers who are part of a group who call themselves Lawyers Are Responsible are set to sign a declaration of conscience, vowing to refuse their services in prosecuting protesters from eco-groups such as Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion. The group will also refuse to act on behalf of clients involved in oil and gas on the grounds that they are destroying the environment. So joining me to discuss this from both angles is Paul Powlesland, barrister and climate activist, and former editor of The Sun newspaper, Kelvin McKenzie. I think we might have two very different views here indeed. I will start with you, Paul. Now, Paul, have you signed this declaration? Are you one of these barristers who are pledging that to take this strong stance?
I have, yes.
You have? Why?
Because I believe that in the week that the IPCC report has given its final warning to humanity, we as lawyers need to act on our principles and ensure that we are not supporting those, particularly fossil fuel companies, who are leading us to breach the 1.5 degree limit and therefore putting our civilization in peril, as well as causing the deaths of millions of people in the global south.
Well, there you go, Kelvin McKenzie. This is just the right thing to do, considering our planet may be up in flames soon.
Well, it does make me laugh that barristers, on the one hand, are complaining that they are going broke with the small amounts of money that they're given by the government, but at the same time are prepared to turn down work from the government when they think that that they don't agree with the attitude or the charge. There is an old-fashioned idea that works in the legal circles where it's a cab off the rank. So if somebody comes to you and says, "Will you represent me?" In this case, it will be the governments, and they, regardless of their own personal views, they do represent them. After all, these are the same barristers who would all turn out for 1,000 a day, 10 grand a day, or whatever, for Begum or some multiple killer or something like that. It doesn't matter how shocking somebody is. These are the same barristers who say everybody's entitled to a defence. And now they're saying that actually that we, the motorist who gets caught up on the M25 or gets caught up in some shocking thing on the Dartford Tunnel with some dreadful kind of people, we're not entitled to be because in essence the government are acting on our behalf against these people. So I seriously hope, I don't know whether the barristers and the KCs ever drive cars or ever go around the M25. Perhaps they should try it and see what they make of being delayed for 6 hours by people who have an argument against oil.
Well, Paul, Kelvin makes a few good points there.
Quite a lot to respond to there.
Pardon? What did you say?
I said quite a lot to respond to there.
Quite a lot to respond to, but I will ask you the first question. I think some viewers will be a tad confused as to why lawyers would refuse to prosecute or refuse to defend based on their political views. Surely that disrupts our basic, rule of law.
Well, in effect, the rule of law is already disrupted by the fact that the oil industry, through its huge wealth, is able to employ vastly more lawyers than are available to ordinary people. There are, at the moment, thousands of lawyers in the UK being paid millions, tens of millions of pounds to advance the interests of the oil industry. And that gives them huge power.
But like with any industry, Paul, that's the same with any big industry.
Yeah, but any other industry is not committing the great crime that the fossil fuel industry is committing. We know scientifically that if we continue to expand the oil and gas industry, it will lead to millions of deaths. Therefore, they are committing a great crime, and I, on my conscience, will not facilitate them to continue committing that crime. And actually, it goes back to Kelvin's point about, would you defend, defend a rapist, or would you defend Sharmila Begum? I would actually defend in court a fossil fuel executive who was on a charge of murder or whatever it is, but I would not continue to allow them I will not continue to facilitate them to commit that crime. And that's the key difference, because it's the difference between defending someone in a murder trial and advising them how to continue committing murder. That's the key difference here.
Kelvin, do you see that difference?
I admire him as a barrister. I admire him for making that difference. The reality is the point that your speaker makes is actually a political point. And the answer to what he wants to achieve is not to make a bit of a kerfuffle. I even see, by the way, a couple of KCs are joining in as well, including Byman as well. You know, I didn't even know he was alive. He must be older than me. But so if he wants to change all this, he is not carrying. Regardless, look, the science may well be there. I've been hearing a lot about the science over the last few years, you know, so I'm not sure what the science is always as accurate as people would like. If you want to change this, we have to change our governments. And my sense is that the people are not with your argument, right? Look, none of us want 1.5 or anything. I totally buy all that. But you'd have to change the politics of our country. We would literally need a green party involved. And my question is that your ultimate aim? It's a political aim. It's not really a legal aim.
Is that right, Paul? You should go through politics rather than trying to essentially... I think what you're doing is simply virtue signalling. I mean, a lot of the lawyers who have signed this declaration would never be in the position to defend oil and gas companies because that's not the type of law that they do, or they wouldn't really be there to prosecute Extinction Rebellion protests that get out of hand. So it's a bit of PR, isn't it?
I think the system is already politically gamed by the oil industry. As an example, I do civil injunctions. And what's happened recently is oil companies, including Shell, have given a ton of money to lawyers in the City of London. And those lawyers have gone to the High Court to get injunctions that give a greater punishment for protesting on Shell forecourts than you would get normally for just ordinary public order offences. What that is the oil industry buying their own criminal law and using lawyers to do that. So the oil industry is already gaming the system, as are many wealthy companies. It's interesting to know that the charge. Sorry, go ahead,
Paul. I just want to know: do you think ecocide should be a crime? Do you think that any person who works in the oil and gas industry is a criminal in some way? Because the way you talk about an industry that has changed the lives of people around the world for decades, for centuries even. It has transformed our way of life. Countries like China, India, etc. are still pumping out masses of fossil fuels, carbon emissions, etc., etc. In order for our country to become the country it is now, we've needed oil and gas. I don't like this demonisation of people that have fuelled our very existence.
I think the demonisation must go towards expansion of the fossil fuel industry, and that's what our declaration says. It doesn't say we won't act for fossil fuel companies at all. It's about expansion. And obviously we need to have some oil and gas to make the transition across to a renewable society. So we're not saying don't stop using them straight away. It's about we cannot afford to have any further expansion. And I think it's that expansion that is the criminal act. It is doing an act that we know is going to lead to mass death and destruction and potentially the collapse of our own civilization. You know, the International Energy Agency said back in 2021, we cannot have any further expansion of the oil and gas industry if we want to remain within 1.5.
Well, hang on,
so
Paul,
I don't demonise them for what they've done thus far, and I don't demonise them for making the oil and gas that we need for our transition. What I demonise them for is knowingly continuing to expand when we know the consequences of that.
Well, that makes you quite a liberal in the sort of eco-activism world. It seems like a lot of these activists would like to see anyone who's ever worked in oil and gas be, hung, drawn and quartered. Kelvin, do you worry? Well, it's hard to know where to go with this, really. There's so many things. I mean, just on the climate stuff, we've heard for so long that, this year is the end of the world. If we don't change now, the whole world is going to be, no more, essentially. It's hard to know what to believe.
Well, I must say the expression "the collapse of civilization," which was just used just now, I don't buy that. But look, I'm a good bit older than your speaker. Therefore, if it does collapse, then I've had a very good run out of petrol. But if it doesn't collapse, which I suspect is the case, then a lot of this is really a politicisation of the law, which is fine because it represents a very small amount. And the other aspect is, if I'm a barrister on the other side, I'm thinking to myself, happy days, the government are coming to me. I'm the only person that's prepared to represent them against a group of people who are damaging the lives of ordinary folk going about their business. We're not talking about big oil and gas companies. I'm talking about the plumber and the bricklayer making their way around the M25 and getting caught up at the Dartford Tunnel because there's some halfwit sitting on the bridge up there. Now, that is what I want to see stopped. If he could guarantee that under his system, I would be delighted. So I could carry on rocketing around the M25 without having to worry about whether I'm going to run over some hippie's foot.
Well, there you go. A compromise is to be had, perhaps, Paul. But Paul, just very lastly, I just want to ask you whether you think it is concerning. Do you think our society is well served by lawyers becoming activists? I mean, take away the issue of climate change, just in general.
I think lawyers already are activists. It's a question of who they're activists for. And we already have thousands of lawyers who are activists for the fossil fuel companies because those companies pay them a lot of money, far more than I earn, probably 10 times, if not more, than what I earn doing the work that I'm doing. They are already activists in advancing their causes. And to Kelvin, I would say, if you don't like those protesters doing that kind of protest, what kind of protest do you advocate in the face where I think you've admitted earlier that some is necessary in order to stop us breaching the 1.5 degree target? What do you recommend, Kelvin? Please do tell us. What would you do?
I'd recommend that you get into Westminster Square and you walk around there and you do what most people do, which is whether they're complaining about their pay or they're complaining about climate change. You know as well as I do that politicians have to take on a bulk of protests. And the reality with your argument is that, unfortunately, many clever people like yourself do have this view. The public do not buy it and enjoy filling up their cars or enjoy the fact when they can afford it, by the way, having a heated house through gas. So the reality is, unfortunately, you are a minority. I'm not saying that in 20 years' time you won't be a majority. When you are a majority, then, of course, you will see change. You're not seeing it at the moment because the ordinary man and woman in the street doesn't buy the 1.5. That's the reality. Your PR is not good enough. The science may not be good enough. But anyway, people don't want it. They are not going to be forced into it.
May I just add that I would like to also see climate activists, campaigning against the Chinese Communist Party. They keep building coal plants, don't they? And the same in India, same in most of the developing world. I'd just add that. Thank you very much indeed, barrister and climate activist Paul Powlesland. Thank you for your time. And former editor of The Sun, Kelvin McKenzie there. Now, you've been getting in touch on this very subject. Should we prosecute climate activists? Helen says, let them sign the declaration, but then bar them from practicing law. It's disgraceful the lawyers are making a fortune and fighting against what the British public want. Activists prosecuted and economic migrants deported. They have become too big for their boots. I do think a lot of people would agree with you there. Steve says, I would not want one of these barristers defending me. Well, I wonder if you are an eco-protester or in the oil and gas industry. Sue says, if these barristers are so gullible to believe what the UN says about the urgency of saving the planet, I would not want them to defend me, but I would be happy for them to try and prosecute. Well, there you go. Keep your views coming in to me at gbviews@gbnews.uk. You are watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carville. We've got lots more coming up on today's show. England